Welcome to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered with Perry Clark. This program looks at mental health from unique perspectives and shows you how to manage your life by finding the knots that help you and stay away from the ones that could be a disadvantage. Now, here is your host, Perry Clark.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. This is Perry Clark back with you, licensed marriage and family therapist. I want to remind everyone that this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes. It does not constitute a visit with a licensed mental health professional. Please seek one out in your area to work on your unique health issues. So today's podcast, I'm going to introduce you to another of my fellow brain spotters, someone who has handled trainings as well. But additionally, it begins to start talking about some of our other elements for those of us that are BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, people of color, is talking about some of the experiences that are also connected in their work and also to the Native American world. So because I want to make sure that we're getting as much representation about our experiences with mental health and working with it as possible. So this gentleman is also one of the people who did my training when 2020 happened and we had to switch over to doing a lot more virtual trainings to help me understand how to bring brain spotting into the virtual environment. So I want to introduce you all to Steve Sawyer, licensed clinical social worker, and I apologize, I don't know what these abbreviations are, but CSAC. Steve is a dual licensed psychotherapist filled with passion and knowledge surrounding the intervention and change process. His experiences come from 2 decades of intervention with tough-to-reach client populations in therapy settings ranging from residential, community-based, outpatient, and wilderness therapy. He is a trained trainer of several unique therapeutic models, including Brainspotting and HeartMath. Steve co-founded the New Vision Wilderness Therapy Program with a trauma-informed and clinical focus with 3 locations spanning the country. He continues to work as a core therapeutic training development staff with the Institute of HeartMath, receiving their Humanitarian Heart Award in 2018, and he is a leading active international brain spotting trainer. Along with his training of phase 1 and 2, he developed the developmental training focus model of brain spotting. Steve's native focused work is as a well variety mending broken hearts trainer and Generation Red Road facilitator. Steve spends time amongst trauma-focused treatment masters like Gormate and Bessel van der Kolk. Steve's trainings are recognized nationwide for their cutting-edge therapeutic techniques, science, and inspiration. Steve, welcome to Untying Knots.
Thanks. Welcome. I just really appreciate the welcome here, Perry. So glad to be here.
Glad to have you. So as I ask everybody, how did you get here?
Yeah, well, it's been a journey. I wasn't one of the individuals that when I was in high school was thinking about being a mental health professional. I can promise you that.
Most of us
I was one of the more challenging youth of our day, but I was actually slated to be going to be a law enforcement person. I was on a track and field scholarship in college and going to do criminal justice and was in it for the adrenaline part of things, and gratefully was swayed by another clinical social worker to start mentoring youth. And I started mentoring youth and really, really appreciated my time with them. And I saw one of those young men get arrested one day, and it broke my heart, and it literally immediately led to a swerve away from the criminal justice track I was in school, and went into social work, and early on just really got involved early in my college years in working in residential treatment programs for at-risk youth. I was working specifically with young men coming out of corrections at that time, and just really embraced like the time and the work and the challenge of working with them. And so that led it to a whole trajectory of becoming a mental health clinician and everything else.
Very nice. Very nice. And actually, I kind of wonder, you brought up a very interesting part, especially given as a Black man and as a man who has connections to Native American, the notion about law enforcement and the thing that drove you at first was that adrenaline rush.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, I think that I talk a lot on men's issues and young men issues and things like that, and they're inside of all of us in those younger years, late teen years and early 20 years when we're in college. There's a warrior energy element there that doesn't get expressed in most of today's culture and world. And so inside of that, either, individuals are involved in conflict with other males through fighting and fight club kind of stuff, or, and that's a power and control dynamic, the law enforcement variable. There's no doubt like there's an element there. And for me, when I said that, it was more about, trying to help save people's lives and, being in those, that's, I never envisioned being a straight kind of street police officer. I was, more interested in kind of like, SWAT team kind of work and high intensity situations that way, which has an adrenaline appeal for a lot of, I think, young men, same with military, right? Mm-hmm. So I came from a military family. My dad was a Marine. So there was this kind of element that just captivated me as a young man in my developmental years around that. And, it since got directed in a very different direction, but that was a little bit of that anyways.
Yeah. Well, but I think that's also a very important factor too and this is also a part of a conversation I had with Dr. Paula Langford when she was talking about the football field. We know that there's only a limited number of sports teams and major teams that are getting paid, and yet there are even more hundreds of places for people to start out in the football field and whittle down into those limited number of teams. But just as equally, whether in the military, whether in the police, SWAT is a very limited focus, limited quantity of people, which has everybody vying for it. So one of those subtle things is there even a degree of regret or feeling of loss, the fact that, I wanted the cops to be a SWAT member, and yet I'm here being a beat cop.
Yeah. Well, and then how does that manifest in the power and control dynamics of
exactly
we see on the streets that harm BIPOC people and communities on a regular basis, right?
Exactly. How is it a mischanneled use of that energy?
Yeah, absolutely, no doubt. Well, and that's in my work in wilderness therapy, that's how I came to be a wilderness therapist, was working with at-risk males. Mm-hmm. And our groups serve male and female and gender fluid students also. But my beginning in it was taking young men into a more adventurous experience that had movement, had some challenge within it, had group culture that we hone and work on. And we know with adolescent males and adolescents in general that one of their highest level influences is peers. And so when you have a peer dynamic that you can work on constantly day in and day out, that's what's one of the beauties of wilderness therapy is that we can work on the milieu and structure a lot and develop a milieu that has healthy challenge in it and connection and comes from that place. So
for those listeners who do not know what milieu means, could you define that?
Yeah, you bet. So from my perspective, milieu is the therapeutic environment that's based upon the group of individuals and how they're connected to each other in a group setting. And so milieu in a therapeutic placement. So in wilderness therapy, our students are placed with us and they're in our care 24 hours a day for up to 90 days of a time. That group that they're living with, which includes staff that are on a rotational step, that milieu is how that group, the culture of that group. And we have all kinds of environmental factors that we can work with, whether it's team building exercises and experiential. Wilderness therapy is very much experiential. So when we talk about milieu, it's much less about like kind of sitting on the couch and watching TV together in a residential treatment versus maybe some of the things we might do as a group, going canoeing together or rafting or going fishing together as a group. So all of that builds a culture of what we would call the milieu in wilderness therapy that all influences it.
very much so. And it sort of comes back to something I know I've been saying recently, is that the concept, especially in African culture, is that it takes a village to raise a child. Well,
Yeah.
what is the nature that village is also trying to bring out in that child?
Yes. Yeah. Well, the spin I use in a lot of my presentations that goes off of that village raises a child is a child here feel not the warmth of the village, burn the village down.
Right. And so how did the village encourage that more destructive nature?
Yeah. Yeah. And that is right. That's our culture in the United States or whatnot that has created a lot of that in our young people, anger, animosity, and hurt. So,
that sadly cannot be expressed in a way that doesn't also result in destruction or trying to be the next SWAT or SEAL Team 6.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah. So could you tell us a bit more about what HeartMath is?
Yeah, sure. You bet. So I'm a faculty member of that institute. I'm a development faculty. So I've worked with them on a number of the bigger kind of training projects that they had. HeartMath is a stress research institute that is really focused on emotional physiology in terms of how emotions affect the physiology of our body. And then with that, they really scientifically investigated self-regulation tools, tools to regulate my mood, my stress, and what's happening within me. So HeartMath is a training institute as well as a research institute. And when I first met them, which was now 20 years ago, they were very focused on management and stress management on like high level playing field of CEOs in Fortune 500 companies, our Olympic teams, astronauts. They were working with NASA. So high performance, stressful situations. How do we regulate our stress to perform well in that? At that time, they were not really involved or focused on mental health. And they had heard about some of the ways I was using their technology. I was using it with some youth on the south side of Milwaukee in our mental health clinic that were in our anger management program. I was introduced to a friend, and I started using all of that with them. And so that led to a whole mental health. They were actually wanting to shift to a more mental health focused kind of research and implementation of what they had found in stress research. They knew it applied to mental health. They just didn't have somebody who had really worked in it a lot. And so they actually flew me to California, and I showed them all these stress measurements on individuals that were having post-traumatic stress flashbacks, developmental trauma, and different kinds of mental health manifestations. And I had, at that time, by the time they flew me out there, I had hundreds of client readings mental health on what is called heart rate variation measurement. And so, I got involved with them, and HeartMath they have a very simplified technology. It's simplified biofeedback. It's really reasonable, and I would almost call it cheap. And they have all kinds of self-regulation or techniques for managing stress or decision-making when under stress, or when I'm in a stressed relationship, how to influence that, techniques that are built upon regulating the brain to a better space to now be more effective in whatever we're doing at that time. Or manage our mental health symptoms too. So,
right, because the aspect of especially those in post-traumatic, they're being flashed back to or hitting triggers that bring them back into that panic state of that moment.
Yeah. And all the different forms of reactivity that go with that, right? So some people shut down, some people are, belligerent. There's all kinds of different manifestations of stress, and I would call it acute stress response. And so their techniques work incredibly effectively with it. I mean, I had many examples in my earliest years, 20 years ago, doing this work, which was very body focused, Brainspotting, very body focused, very research focused also. So they really understood stress in the brain, and they were trying to find specific ways to enact kind of stability into the nervous system that way.
Which I think that's a lovely segue into talking about brain spotting as well. So between what you're learning and what you've learned in HeartMath, what you've learned in experience, working with the youth. How did Brainspotting become mixed into this? And how you develop the two in concert with each other?
Yeah, sure. I think that's a great question. From very early on, I was always very body focused in my approach all the way along. I was an athlete. I did yoga at that time. I did a lot of, and I always understood this correlation that I personally experienced, which was like when my mood changes, I can feel it in my body, right? And that early on when I was working with a lot of those kinds of more acute mental health, the idea that like we can't do anger management until we can feel anger coming on in our body, right? And we have to feel like when we talk about feelings in psychotherapy, we talk about them. How do you feel? How do we answer that question? We go to our body. So inside of that, early on in my clinical development, I had learned some models that were very physically focused. Even preceding somatic experiencing, Levine's development and work, some work of David Grove was his name he's from Australia and had a kind of a verbal technique of regressing, almost trancing people and working with the body. I was trained in that and had incredible results and did a lot of early trauma work with that and was going along with that. At the same time, around the time frame, EMDR was coming up as very popular. A lot of people were talking about it. At this point, now I'm developed to the point, I was actually running a large clinic. I ran one of the largest clinics at that time in Wisconsin. And I had a team of practitioners. And in our team, we had, expressive arts therapists. We had art therapists. We had sand tray therapists. We had EMDR clinicians. There was clinicians I trained in some of the somatic models I was using and that I had learned. And the switch to Brainspotting and my incredible devotion to that was a personal in nature. I had a very traumatic experience. My mother passed away on her wedding day in a helicopter crash. I was a part of her team, her attempt to save her life team. And when I went through that experience, there was a lot that was trapped in my body. It was on her CPR team. And when I came back to my office after a month of my own wilderness therapy in Alaska, I followed my mom's trail on her dog sled through all of the Alaska cabins in the BLM land up there. The public land, they have cabins that you can rent, and dog mushers will stay at them in the wintertime and then mush from one to the other. I went and did my own time in the mountains. After I came back to my clinic, I went to my clinic supervisor, who I really trusted as a clinician, and said, "Well, what would you do?" And he knew I would come back and I would want to go do my own work on this event. And he says, "Well, you know what I'm going to tell you." And he was a big EMDR practitioner. I said, "Okay, well, who?" Because here we were at this point, I was actually pioneering trauma-informed care in the state of Wisconsin. And you knew almost everybody around. And he told me who. So I went to that individual, and a few sessions into it, because of my body awareness, my desire to heal, and my just somewhat aggressive or intense nature, I wanted to go at it. I wanted to do the work directly on this accident. I could feel it. I felt a lot of it in my shoulder and my body related to being on the CPR team. When I went in there, we did, back then, EMDR was all about eye movements, back and forth and back and forth. And every time I came to the left side of my visual field, as we were going back and forth, I could feel all this emotion rise up, and then I'd feel my shoulders start to ache. And we would go back and forth, but as I went back to the right, I'd be like, "Well, no, it's going away, it's going away." And then he'd come back to the left, and I'd be like, "No, there it is, there it is." And I could feel it every time I went back and forth, left to right. Like I could feel one side well way up and one side go away. And because of my kind of inner intuitive nature, it's like I wanted to go at it all the way. And I stopped him after about halfway through that session and just said, "Hey, this is what I'm experiencing." He's like, "Hey, Steve, I don't know what to tell you. Like, let's just keep going." And I said, "Okay." So we keep going. But intuitively, internally, I knew, I was like, "No, this ain't doing what I want it to do." And inside of that, I stopped him again after a period of these eye movements. And I said, "Listen, like I can feel it. Not only is it on this left side, it's really welling up, but it feels like it's even above eye level.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, can we do something with that? And this was a key moment for me. Is he said to me, Steve, we don't have a protocol for that. And that's all I needed to hear, which is like, you're telling me you don't have a solution for what my intuitive nature was saying is up here and to the left.
Mm-hmm.
I did through client compliance. I tried again, right? And we did, I think, 2 more sessions, and I finally walked away and just didn't go back. I couldn't feel the solution coming. As I got towards the solution, he moved me away from it. And by the eye movements that were happening. And so I shared this experience with one of my really close dear friends. He's now a brain spotting trainer too, Jeff Ryan. And he was an EMDR level 2, highly trained. And I explained this to him, and he's like, interesting, Steve. He knew my story on that. So I never, I didn't tell any of my clinicians on my team. I had started wilderness therapy at that point. Our program, I didn't tell any of my clinicians they couldn't do EMDR, or I didn't tell anybody not to go get EMDR. I just didn't believe in it fully. And so one day he came to me and said, Steve, somebody figured it out. And I said, he said it in this like interesting way. And what caught my attention, I was like, figured out what? He's like, they figured out trauma work. They're doing it on the precise held eye position related to what they're working on, the highest felt sense of the suffering, the struggle, whatever. And I said, where? And he said, I think like in Boulder, Colorado. I said, what is it called? He said, Brainspotting. Really? What is that? And he said, Boulder, Colorado is like, and literally 2 weeks later, I was in a training because I knew when he explained to me how they were doing it. Boom. I watched a YouTube video to whatever, and then boom, I was in a training. In that training, I got more relief than I had in all that other effort. And I'm the kind of person that, like, if something works that precisely and it came from, there was an intuitive nature to it, I was like, I'm going to figure out what the heck this is about. So since that time, I've done, and this isn't breaking confidentiality, like he shares about it openly, especially we're together in a conference together, but I've done brain spotting on Gabor Mate, right? I've had ongoing debates and discussions with Bessel van der Kolk around brain spotting, who he now supports brain spotting. And I wanted, and I think a really important person in that journey was Stephen Porges, a combination of Stephen Porges and Damir Damont. Both these men are very scientifically minded and educated and sharp, and were able to explain to me the why behind brain spotting's held eye position. And so from then on, like, that I was really focused on brain spotting as a primary clinical modality. I mean, we still teach our clients HeartMath self-regulation, but I describe brain spotting as the tweezers in trauma work. We can have a splinter that's infected for a really long time. We can put a numbing agent on it so it doesn't hurt as much. But how do we get the splinter out? And that's what brain spotting is to me.
Very lovely. Very lovely. And I think it's one of those, again, what you've also brought up to that aspect is the classic problem of that often gets put towards BIPOC people, is that we're not treatment compliant. We're completely resistant. As opposed to, no, the treatment was the wrong one for us.
Yeah. And anybody who, can't at least make a reasonable description of me about what they're doing and why they're doing it. And speaking of the Native community, like somebody who starts talking kind of pseudoscience or spiritual, there's a large clarity in our community and respect for elders that have teachings or stories or reasoning behind what they're doing. So if you can't give me any of that, and I just don't have a way to do that, Steve, like I'm out, you start to explain to me something, from a spiritual perspective or whatever, if it doesn't align, like I'm out. So there's a lot of that you're right. It's a variable that culturally healthy skepticism and even developmental trauma protectivism is an element, especially when somebody in front of us is supposedly an expert. There's a power and control dynamic there, and now you're in charge of my care. help me understand why we're doing this, and I'll be on board as long as you got a reasonable and clear description to it. But if you don't, I'm not, like you said, I'm not going to be treatment compliant just because you're supposedly good at this.
Or that the manual says to do it this way, or the protocol says to do it this way.
Yes. And that for me is one of the most powerful elements of what Brainspotting. David Grant has done a wonderful job. And he says this, and I've been blessed to spend a lot of time with David, unlike a lot of practitioners of these days, that he strategically, everything that felt like it might get in the way, he pulled it out of the way. If anything was pushing a client to do something, he tried to eliminate it, tried to eliminate all the power and control dynamics in it, And so now, of course, we're a professional sitting in front of them, and we can only eliminate so much of that, right? But anyways, so that you're absolutely right, though, that treatment compliance and kind of abstinence or all those things, like that's, a healthy thing for the BIPOC community to maintain, to ask questions and push back and be able to get some reasonable answers.
So before we go on the break, I think that's I want your opinion and thoughts on this then. Is that also part of the reason that it may be so difficult to get more of us into the field?
Yes. Yeah, I would think so. Right. It's a role that you're stepping into. Right? Yeah, it's a role that you're stepping into. And, I think that's interesting when I think about it from a more indigenous perspective. And to be really clear, like before I go any further, even on that topic, like I grew up, unbeknownst to me, I grew up as a white privileged male, and so I always acknowledge that when I'm talking about any of these topics. I grew up that way. Later found out of my indigenous roots, but then also have absorbed myself in indigenous culture, community, and helping. Hence some of those things that were mentioned in my bio. But when I think about it, like being a helper, from an indigenous perspective, like those are, that's a pretty loaded expectation. And there's a level of humility that comes in Native community. Like, I don't want to step into that kind of position of power. I would never want to take the reins on somebody else's healing experience or that, because that's designated to specific helper people or people of, medicine family, etc. Right. So that dynamic of stepping into that and potentially, I could see where there would be an aversion to that, that's built into even culturally at some level. Beyond
just the issues of money and getting access to the training and so forth.
Oh, but all that on top of it, right?
Just that emotional weight. And as we started out by saying that, some of us purposely come into this because of the experiences we've had with others who have helped. Some have come with that aspect that they want to heal themselves. I know in my case, it was basically the universe was talking, I was listening, so I'm here doing all this, as opposed to I was purposely looking for my healing or feeling the calls for it. But it's like there's a weight there that goes on an entirely other level, existential, if you will, that doesn't always get recognized in this work, doesn't get recognized in the science, doesn't get recognized in when we are showing that this is a path for people to take. Yeah,
no doubt. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's a great place for us to take a break.
All right.
So folks, stay tuned for our second half here on Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. I'm Perry Clark, licensed marriage and family therapist, here with Steve Sawyer, licensed CSAC, and we'll be back shortly, so hang in there.
Have you friended us on Facebook yet? Why not? Just go to facebook.com/Voice America or search for the keywords Voice America. Once you are part of our Facebook network, you'll receive daily messages about what's happening with our shows, this week's featured guests, and new happenings at the Voice America Talk Radio Network. And you can add your voice to the always active discussions on our timeline. Just go to facebook.com/Voice America or search for Voice America.
Our lives and the world around us can get messy and frustrating. Untangle and Grow Counseling's focus is to untangle that mess and make sense of it. so you have a good foundation to build and grow from. Visit us on the web at untangleandgrowcounseling.com. Perry Clark offers individual psychotherapy, couples and family therapy, and adolescence therapy from a variety of coping materials and resources. Visit untangleandgrowcounseling.com for more information.
Get the news on our shows and other happenings by following us on Twitter. Find us at VoiceAmericaTRN or twitter.com/VoiceAmericaTRN.
You are listening to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. If you have a question or comment about our podcast, send an email to pclark@untyingnotspodcast.com. That's pclark@untyingnotspodcast.com. And now, back to the program.
Hello all, welcome back to the second half here on Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. I'm Perry Clark, licensed marriage and family therapist, here with Steve Sawyer, licensed clinical social worker. So hopefully you've enjoyed our first half as we sort of explored some other areas there, but we're going to continue talking a bit more about the brain spotting and especially the developmental trauma model that you use and developed for brain spotting. So what can you share for our listeners about that so that they can come see you for training and those that you have trained?
Yeah, you bet. I think that one of the challenges to a lot of the therapeutic world is that so many of us clinicians are working at a deeper level on trauma and working on generational issues, things like that, is this variable of the time frame in our lives that we can't remember well and we can't articulate well. And wonderfully so, brain spotting tends to just explore that by in and of itself, pretty effectively. But it's kind of left to just see kind of what happens versus a more structural kind of approach of understanding, first of all, what are the manifestations of developmental trauma when somebody has like actual developmental trauma in their history, how does it manifest? And so I teach a lot about that and what the research has shown us. And, that the primary outcome of developmental trauma we know early on falls in different categories of dysregulation. And these are oftentimes what brings people in. They're having a marriage problem because there's some kind of dysregulation in the relationship, but it stems all the way back to the earliest developmental process. So we come in and we work on this dysregulation inside of this relationship right here now. But the entire roots of that plant are still left undercover in the soil.
Right.
And so how do we, when we work with people that want to work on developmental trauma, get the most precise forms of access to that? And then also inside of that, some of the adaptations, even to what we do inside of brain spotting, that rules or things that are put in place around setups even, or whatever that might steer us either to or away from access to very non-verbal time frame information. How do we work strategically in there? And so there's a lot to that. I mean, it's I did it in one day. People were like, that's way too much in one day. Then I did it 2 days and they're like, Steve, would you please do more on this, and this? And then now we're at 3 days of training, and who knows, the most recent proposed was that the group that kind of follows and we do work group with this stuff is saying that I should be doing 4 days, 2 days, have a week of brain rest, and then have another 2 days. So we'll see where we go with that. So
any combination is good for the training. It's just, as I know from my trainings, it's like, okay, there's some stuff you've been front loaded. There's stuff that's like, could we slow down on that? There's everyone who's rushing on this. It's like, okay, I'm getting in what I can.
Yep. No doubt.
And so with the developmental training and trauma recognition there, I guess someone would ask, like, how does this relate to attachment and such? And I would often say that something like that is, okay, well, you're using brain spotting and this developmental training to help process that attachment, as opposed to it's supposed to do something specific, or which is another of that power and control issues we see with methodologies that are in our field.
Yeah. And so it's interesting. There's themes of pockets that come up in just natural brain spotting work that people might just kind of breeze past. For example, a client that says, I'm just sensing something here, but I don't know what it is. And because we don't have an answer or a setup for something's there, we kind of race past it when they're actually touching into something on their physiology level that's really important. And so being able to stop and slow down and focus in on those kinds of things when they come up around relational conflict in a marriage can be a gateway to incredibly powerful information and resolution. But a lot of times we kind of rush past that. Well, we'll come back to that and see if something comes up later or whatever, versus let's stop right now and really just notice that in your body. And so a lot of the developmental trauma work has to be from this perspective of the body starting to tell the story before we even have a grasp of what we're doing right now, cognitively or mentally. And so, everybody talks about, the book, Body Keeps the Score, that changed psychotherapy for the century, got that designation, but we just don't listen. We'll move right past the little score. We don't have a clear definition of it. We don't have a clear approach to how to go after it. So we just kind of leave it, go back undercover, right? Even though the brain and the body at that moment was saying, hey, here you go. You can work on some really early stuff here.
To use a more metaphor that probably people more recognize is, it's the gift wrapped box, but it's the small one versus the big one.
Yes.
And you're focusing on the big one and not even noticing that the small one actually has got may have the key to that car, or may have that $1,000 diamond ring in it and stuff. Or because you want the big present, which is basically just got the teddy bear.
Well, and I want to have a happy marriage, and we're going to have a happy marriage now because we talked about this. But the key to really unlocking connection and intimacy in that relationship is in that little box that's in a little tiny memory that's from 45 years ago, right? And that being missed over and over again, constantly in work. So. That understanding that the early developmental roots and years of our neurobiology development has some of the most important keys to everything that we're struggling with in whatever age we're at.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because again, day in, day out, you are with your caregiver at the beginning of life. Yeah,
absolutely.
How they were functioning. This goes back to the village metaphor. Is what's going to be leading when you're having your argument with your spouse.
Absolutely. And so it's being able to slow down and take an approach that understands that actually, yes, this big present that's in my office right now, let's talk about your guys' conflict with each other, is actually becomes almost secondary to that little box that has the key in it that's back there when I used to argue with my mother when I was 5 years old. And having that level of awareness and then having an approach to go along with that.
And equally the perspective shift, because again, how much is that section still trying to win that argument with mom?
Exactly.
And to it, winning is everything, as opposed to what's going on with the relationship with mom.
Yes. Correct. Yeah. So that's where a lot of that comes from. And I think in the BIPOC community, I actually do some presentations and conferences on this, which is we're talking more and more about generational trauma or historical trauma in the BIPOC community. And the gateway to the gene expression,
which is epigenetics,
the gateway to that gene even being awakened is current developmental trauma. If we want to break the chains of historical trauma or generational trauma, the solution and the key is by cutting the chain of developmental trauma in the current time. Right? It's not about changing what happened. It's about changing how it lives within us. And so we have to work there. And so as I talk with the BIPOC community a lot more these last years, is the solution in this, right? Because there's a limited amount of solution a lot of times when we look at historical generational, because access is limited at some level. We know that Brainspotting can get access to a lot of that. We both probably experienced that in our work. But by focusing on the developmental trauma process, first of all, sometimes we get access to that stuff easier. But second of all, we can start to break the chain in our families moving forward. You know, and I remember having a conversation with Gabor Mate. Me and him were at a hotel together after one of our gigs together, and we were going to meet. And we were doing some work with him around parental guilt of traveling too much. And I said, man, Gabor, this whole conversation, you're triggering me. I'm feeling it because I've been on the road for 2 weeks here and thinking about my sons back at home. And he looked at me and said, Steve, do you repair better than your dad did? And I went in my head and I was like, my dad didn't even have a concept of what repair was. So do I repair better? Like night and day, completely different. Repair almost everything, like surgically, repair stuff, right? And inside of that, the awareness, and then he said, like that's how the chain is broken, right? And so in the BIPOC community, treating developmental trauma and really doing it well can change and start to break the chains of this historical and generational trauma of epigenetics, because epigenetics has to have a modern and a current expression to make that gene dominant. So for that gene to become dominant and awoken, it requires developmental trauma that breeds of the same nature for that gene to come online and become our survival tool now in the current time. Well, it's trapped in our epigenetics. We have lots of genetic codes inside of us. It doesn't come to expression until it has to.
Right.
And then once it does, and it's alive, the more experiences we have with it, then the more dominating it becomes, right?
Yeah. Somewhere in the family line, most everybody was green-eyed, but at some point, they all became hazel.
Yep. So inside of that, what creates these adaptations? It's the modern time work of developmental trauma that we can work to break that chain and move forward in the next generation without them carrying on the need to express my protectedness, etc.
So I think that's an interesting segue into the classic question I ask here is, what's our myths and realities around mental health and now even trauma? What are you, given that lead up we just had, what do you think there?
Yeah, I love it. I was blessed that Gabor gave me his newest book that was just released this week, the Myth of Normal, in advance, and had me reading some of the chapters and thoughts on it. And this idea of normal and then pathology, right? And even trauma. So in there, what is in his first chapter, he starts to write about what is trauma and then what is not trauma. In this world, current time, one of the biggest misnomers, especially going around COVID, is we're all being traumatized. We're all being traumatized. Right? And by neurology and by definition in our criteria as mental health professionals, you can't label something as trauma until the threat is no longer present. And then we have manifestations still hindering our functioning after that. And so this word trauma, I love it. Listen, I was a huge proponent 20 years ago around trauma-informed care, and now pushing into trauma-responsive care. Is that this word gets thrown around so much that we've started to not differentiate acute stress response, what's just regular stress response, and then what is trauma response, and pulling that apart very carefully. Because when we start telling people they're traumatized by something, there's a level of pathology that goes with that is misleading also if you're in an acute stress response or just stressed, right? What does regular stress look like? This isn't trauma, this is just the stress of being in a situation. So for me, that in our mental health field, and the hypersensitivity and the overemphasis of this word trauma, has a lot of implications too. And so for me, that's kind of a big thing, I guess. And I've been talking about that a lot and pulling that apart for people more and more around understanding acute stress response and survival mechanism, trauma stress response, pulling that apart, and then going further than just trauma. Let's take trauma and break that down into post-traumatic stress, complex trauma, developmental trauma. All three of them having very different manifestations. We just use this word, it's this blanket word trauma, and then we don't even have a common language what each one of those variables differences are.
Right.
So those are some of my bigger misnomers or kind of concerns around the mental health field and labeling of things.
Which in some ways is probably also being exacerbated by our Instagram and TikTok. Generations that are not making those distinctions because it's taking longer than what they've got on their recording span, or the aspect of it's not as catchy.
Right.
Well,
absolutely. You know, and people are just blatantly saying, "Oh, I'm traumatized over this, and I'm traumatized over that," and that's not accurate. It's not even unless it was an extreme experience, right? Mm-hmm. It's not going to fall under the criteria of trauma. And so what it does is it downplays other people's experiences. It's like, wait, you're calling that trauma? No, this is what trauma looks like. And what I do, another one to go with that is big T's and little T's. There's therapists that listen to this. I love it. Gabbard just nailed it in his book. There's a section in there on big T's and little T's, and he talks directly about it and how measurement of trauma in general is just totally ineffective.
Mm-hmm. It's subjective.
Yes, exactly. And it's a subjective inner developmental measure. And then when people start, well, I have little T's, but they're dominating and affecting their life. They have little traumas, but it's dominating their life. Somehow that's different than, well, if I had big T's, or boy, I'm really messed up because I only have little T's and I'm such a mess. Like, so that the self-pathologizing that goes with these judgments and these labels. I mean, think about that. The word little T, little trauma.
Minimize. It's not something we should be paying as much attention to. So it almost brings up there's an aspect of that once more we're seeing the domination and control power and control narrative going into what is regulating the big T, what is regulating the small t, what is the definition between each of these different acute to complex to developmental.
And in Brainspotting, does it really matter? No. Like, we sit down and we're with you and we work and we focus on the neurophysiology that's in your body related to this pain that you have. Call it a big T, little t, or just a stress response. We focus on that and we sit with you within that and we work on releasing that from your neurophysiology. How you measure it has very little bearing on what the outcome is, in terms of release. So, a person who has a massive, enormous big T can get the same amount of release oftentimes in the same amount of time as somebody who has a stress. And so that's how powerful that modality is in working that way. So
I think that is a beautiful place for us to end our talks for today. Where can people find you if they want to learn more about any of these things we've discussed, as well as where can we direct people if they're interested in learning more about Brainspotting and these other areas, and even Corbet's book?
My primary place of expression of what I'm up to is through my Trauma Transformations Instagram page. So it's just Trauma Transformations, all spelled out. You have to have that plural on there to find me. That's where I post a lot of stuff that I'm up to. I put different things. I posted some of the quotes from Gabbard's book on there just recently, for example. Trauma thinking. A lot of my time is committed to our wilderness therapy programs. So newvisionwilderness.com, DeschutesWilderness.com in Oregon, and then First Light Wilderness in Georgia. All three of those programs I visit, I work with them, and I clinically consult with all of them. And then with Brainspotting, Brainspotting.com is obviously our largest kind of hub of information and training. Anything that I'm doing, phase 1, phase 2, developmental trauma model, native focused Brainspotting trainings, all of those I usually post on our Trauma Transformations page there. And that's where I put most of that. So those are the best place. That's the best place probably to watch and monitor me. I've got some more work to do on other avenues for that, but that's the easiest place to look.
I know we didn't get a chance to talk too much about the Wellbriety and stuff, but hey, maybe that's a part 2 sometime.
You betcha. I'm more than willing to share about it. It's a very powerful, culturally focused support system for addictions in Native people.
Okay, so I think we'll be planning a second episode for that one soon.
Beautiful.
All righty. Well, folks, I want to thank you for coming and listening, and here with Steve Sawyer, licensed clinical social worker. I'm Perry Clark, licensed marriage and family therapist, and stay tuned as we start this, as we're going into this year of 2023, and I hope to have much more for you to be able to hear and listen and learn. So be well, be safe. Ashe.
Thank you for tuning in for Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. Be sure to join your host, Perry Clark, for another episode on the podcast coming soon on the Voice America Empowerment Channel.